and welcome to Round Robin. I'm your host, Robin McCormick with the City of Hampton, and today we're going to take a look at the city's planning process, which is a little bit of mystery to most of us who are outside the process. I have with me a staff member and a board member and how they work together. My guests are Tolu Ibikunle and Tommy Southall. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
When I was not with the city but was kind of an outside observer, I didn't understand the whole planning commission process because a lot of what you guys do ends up at city council anyway. So, I think people don't always understand all of the groundwork. So maybe I'll start with Tolu because a lot of things come from the staff, to the appointed commission. How do you guys work? I mean, planning, that sounds like a job where, you sit back and dream about stuff, no?
No. No, a lot of work goes into planning. It's essentially land use development. And it focuses on that and the impact that various proposals for land use development impact the community. That's really an essential focus of it. When we receive proposals, for example, for daycares or rezoning for a new use, all of that goes through Planning Commission because they are the board that really focuses on those impacts to the community and how those proposals can really not just have a positive impact on the community, but also the economic development aspect of it as well. So when staff receives those proposals, they go through a vetting process where we're doing a lot of research, looking into the zoning, what's permitted on the land. Again, I talked about those impacts, but also environmental impacts, because we want to make sure that what's being proposed isn't impeding on the environmental integrity that we have in our community. And when we once we go through that research process, we work with our planning commission because they then make a recommendation to our city council. So that's what you were referring to, is in the end it always goes through city council.
But you guys really set not by yourselves, but the policies about land use. And I know the first time I started coming to planning commission meetings, I was really surprised by how much you go back to the community plan. That's I think we do the community plan and then it sits there on the shelf and then, we revive the community plan, but you guys use it like every day.
Every day, absolutely. That community plan is our go-to guide, our tool for everything that involves land use planning. It's not just a plan that staff and planning commission create. It's essentially what it sounds like, the community plan. It's adopted by council. And what we use that community plan is there are several policy recommendations in there that help us make our decision for recommendation of approval or denial. And that is also what the Planning Commission uses it for as well. And by the time it gets to City Council, by that time we have presented how the proposal is in line with this community plan, because it's ultimately the vision for our city. And we want to make sure that whatever proposal is on the table, it furthers that vision.
Okay, so Tommy, you were recently elected chair of the commission, but you've been on there for about 3 years.
Yes.
You were on the neighborhood commission before that.
Yes.
How are they different or how are they alike, those two major bodies in our city?
The big difference is, I think when I worked with neighborhoods on the neighborhood commission, it's more of an emotional decision that you have to make. You make decisions based on people's feelings, on how they feel about their neighborhoods. And with the Planning Commission, the state code stipulates how we make our decisions, and we have to make our decisions based on the community plan and any adopted policies through the city to make sure that the land use or the use permit is permittable and is in conjunction with our community plan. It's going to further that plan. It becomes very difficult sometimes, and people don't understand as commissioners why we don't vote differently than we do, but we do make a recommendation to City Council that these applications are in accordance with with the community plan, and that we recommend approval or denial if that be the case. But we can't just make the decision on a motion.
And some things, you know, seem like fairly easy decisions. I've sat through a lot of discussions of live music permits. And in certain areas, I think a lot of them have been downtown or Coliseum Central, they're in business areas, and it's a kind of easy decision because there's businesses all around and they have similar hours and similar permits, but sometimes it might be an establishment that backs up to a neighborhood a little bit differently, and things can be more complicated. How do you weigh those kinds of things?
Once again, you know, I'm bound by the state code to look at the community plan, the land use plans, and we have to make our decisions on that. As hard as it is, I've made some decisions or made some votes that had I been on a different board, I would have reacted differently, I believe. But because the application was in accordance with our plan, and in the event of live music, it promotes entertainment within the city. That's within our community plan, and so we have to follow that plan. We're kind of a custodian of that plan, and we have to make sure that these applications are in accordance.
Well, the other thing I think, you know, when you're on the neighborhood commission, you're really kind of focused on the health of the neighborhood. When you're on the planning commission, you look at the health of the city.
Right.
And sometimes that might lead you in a little bit different direction.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to ask you, like, you guys don't always agree. I remember there was an instance when the city staff recommended against something, and it wasn't something that people maybe didn't want. It just didn't fit the letter of the plans that we had. And it was Todd Center. There was this plan for a storage unit, but it had this unique component of being an internet service fulfillment. And I think the Planning Commission staff said, you know what, it just doesn't. It just doesn't meet what we're zoned for. It doesn't meet the guidelines. But the recommendation that went to council was different. And I remember the story in the newspaper was like, Planning Commission didn't follow the staff. That's not animosity. That's really, you guys look at different things. You guys can't consider everything that the board can, right?
Yes. In essence, sometimes we are going to disagree, and that's okay. That's the part of the democratic process.
And sometimes council's going to follow your recommendation, and sometimes they're not, because
Yes.
there's other factors they get to consider. So
Yes, but when we look at certain factors, with that particular case that you're referencing, some of the members in the neighborhood near that site they were just concerned about the character, and we did work closely with them to ensure that, for example, the proffer agreement detailed conditions that would allow what it would essentially be built out as would be in keeping with the character. So while sometimes we may not agree on certain decisions, as staff, we try to look at potential negative or adverse impacts it may have on the community or adjacent neighborhood, and try to identify and work with the applicant, the community, conditions that would basically mitigate that.
well, that's what I was going to say. You guys do some negotiation, really, before it even comes to your level. You use the word proffer, and that's not a word everybody understands. So
Yes.
tell us what that means.
So it's basically, it's the applicant has the choice. It's the choice to consider certain conditions that would help them construct what they're interested in constructing, but also put conditions in place to ensure that the community is more comfortable with that. So, for example, a proffered condition is basically a contract. It's binding. It runs with the land. And if, say, for example, there's a development where the community wanted more of a buffer between the proposed development and their neighborhood.
Which is pretty common.
Yes,
There's a
very
lot of
common.
those, yeah.
The applicant may choose to include a condition in there that says we will have a landscape buffer that screens the proposed development from the neighborhood, and that is pretty common. And it'll spell out
It could be
how many,
fencing,
yes,
right.
fencing, the type, even down to the type of vegetation to ensure that it's thick enough to screen, and even down to the type of fence that they use, a decorative fence as opposed to chain link. So ultimately, it's a contract between that runs with the land.
Okay, and building materials are also a big deal too, I think.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you guys want to make sure that it's going to fit in with the character of what it's around. And it can be hard to get a new building to fit in with some of our older or historic kinds of areas. What are other things you look for or you are interested in terms of land use and planning issues?
Well, I believe probably the biggest thing that I look for, as Tolu has indicated, is the negative impacts. Are there going to be negative impacts to the surrounding areas, whatever they may be? Generally, in Hampton, we find that most of these impacts are to neighborhoods, and we try to minimize those impacts. We try to get the applicant to make the proffers to make the development more pleasurable to the surrounding areas.
One of the things I think is that we're not always good at getting out the word about what's coming before the Planning Commission. And a lot of times it'll come up at Planning Commission and that's when the neighborhood hears about it. And then they all show up at council to react. But if we could get them there sooner and they could have the discussions, you guys really, really encourage people to hold community meetings. I don't know that happens in other localities.
Yes, I don't know that it does either. It's legally, it is a requirement, to advertise for the public hearings at Planning Commission and City Council. But Hampton really does go above and beyond that legal requirement in encouraging the applicant to hold a community meeting. And the staff works with the applicant to disseminate that information. So we do make a huge effort to make sure that everyone's included. But unfortunately, as it goes, like you just mentioned, sometimes people just don't hear about it until Planning Commission.
We all have such busy lives. It's very hard to focus on things until it reaches, a certain fever pitch, I think.
Yes.
But you guys always ask, was there a community meeting held? What was the results? And sometimes it is, they held a community meeting, but no one came. And sometimes it's bigger and more challenging than that.
Right. And I think a big part of that is to make sure that if the community surrounding the area is totally against it, we want to know what it is they're against and see if we can't work through some of those, because you really want it to be a win-win situation for the applicant and for the residents that live nearby.
Well, and I know one of the things that has come up sometimes when it has been something controversial is also, people want, I remember the neighborhood saying, oh, well, we don't want that use. We want a park. We want a community center. We want the city to come build things. Well, that's good, but I don't think the city has the money to do that. So you also have to look at what's realistically can go there. And sometimes what can go there by right, without a hearing, without a rezoning, is maybe more difficult for the neighborhood than what the proposal is. So you guys spend a lot of time sort of moderating and mediating, don't you?
Yes, we do. We certainly do. And with that, even when an applicant does host a community meeting, staff is there to assist in answering some of those city-related questions that the community may have. So in the event something like that happens, or a question like, well, if this proposal doesn't go here, what could? And we explain that. So we try as much as possible to be transparent.
Okay. Tell me, what are some of your tougher decisions that you've had to make?
I believe probably we've had some developments that have gone in next to some residential areas. We had one that I can recall that I received a petition with over 400 signatures.
Wow.
In favor of this applicant. And I went through every signature, but I didn't find any residents that were next to the development. I found signatures from across town, which it's great. Put it in their backyard, but don't put it in mine. And that's one of the things that we have to be very careful of. I've had people come before the commission and say, well, if this development goes up, it's going to take away the sunset that we enjoy watching in the evenings. And Unfortunately, that's a problem with development. You gain things, but you also lose things. So it's very hard, and I always encourage people to attend the city council meetings and to air their concerns, because city council can take their concerns into
A little more than,
the
yeah,
decision-making factor, where we're more bound by the code, the state code, and by the community plans. They have a little bit more leeway in their decision-making.
I think it's going to be a challenge for Hampton as we move toward, one of the things City Council has said is we're a little too residential. We need more commercial development in town. And if you begin to take areas that used to be residential or that weren't built out and create more commercial spaces, that's going to start to infringe. And so you're going to have these questions potentially more and more, but then the also issue is, how can you grow Hampton's tax base? You have to have more of a tax base than just residents,
right,
because you can't generate enough income to have the services that we want. One thing I know that has got a lot of legal implications is cell phone towers. A lot of people, nobody wants a cell tower in their backyard. They're very uncomfortable with it. It's not necessarily pretty. It has caused a lot of controversy, but there's federal laws. You have to allow them somewhere.
Yes.
How do you guys go about negotiating that?
Well, again, as part of that land use application process, we do a lot of research and working with the applicant. With communication towers, they've come a long way in the way that they look. Previously, they were bulkier, not very pleasing to the eye, and honestly, they still have a long way to go when it comes to design, but they've become a lot more slimmer, and they are, in even some designs, you can kind of make it into a flagpole.
Right,
so sometimes
right.
when you pass one,
or
you
the
don't,
booster
yes,
poles that aren't the full.
Yes, yes. So what we really do is just make sure from the beginning of the process we're including the community and they're aware of where the proposed sites are. But we have a hierarchy in our community plan that talks about co-locating to ensure that we don't have communication towers all over the place if there's an opportunity to co-locate. And when I'm referring to co-location, it's several different providers. So for example, you may have Verizon,
right,
T-Mobile, Sprint. So that also helps. And we also consider screening at the base where you have to have that ground equipment that looks pretty boxy and isn't very pleasing to the eye, if we can use landscaping and things like that. But like you said, they have to go somewhere as per the law, but we just focus on how we can mitigate the visual impacts that it may have on the community.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything I've forgotten to ask you about before we wrap up?
I would just like to make the comment that people may not be aware of our planning staff, but we have a super planning staff. Very impressed with the packages that we receive. We receive our packages about 2 weeks prior to the meeting.
I know, council only gets theirs like 5 days.
I had the privilege of meeting with planning commissioners across the state of Virginia and shared with them about our planning staff and the packages that we receive, and they were floored because they don't have the luxury of receiving such packages. And so I'd commend their staff for the job that they do. They do an awesome job for us.
Well, wonderful. And I commend our
you.
board for the job they do, because the commission really, I want to say, listens to everybody who comes forward or who writes in and takes those views into account.
Yes, and I have to say the same thing likewise to our commission and the work that they do. I know it's not easy to make those decisions, and we really, you all make it easier for staff because you're very approachable. The communication is always open, so we really appreciate you. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for coming.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching. I hope you understand a little bit more about a fairly complex process, but we can break it down. And make sure you watch the Hampton.gov website and know when Planning Commission items might affect your neighborhood. If you get a little postcard in the mail or if there's a sign in your neighborhood, pay attention and get involved in what's going on. Thanks for watching.